Tim Vickery, take us, though, back to Brazil, to his influence on Brazil, because obviously Brazil has just held these elections, rather divisive elections by any standards. Do you think the figure of Pele is somebody who's been able to unite Brazil despite the clear divisions in other parts of the country?
Well, that's certainly the case over the last few days in a very polarised political climate. The grief over the death of Pele is universal, and he is the greatest diplomat that the country has ever had. What's amazing to me is just the speed of the process. Think about it. As a 9-year-old child, Pele watches his father cry, listening to the radio as Brazil lose the final of the 1950 World Cup. They hadn't won the World Cup at that point. Pele then decides to avenge it. 20 years later, Brazil have won the World Cup and Pele has won the World Cup for the third time, wearing yellow. Now, they were still wearing white in 1950. That yellow shirt by 1970 has already become iconic. Brazil then have become the country that everyone wants to be for a month every 4 years. They're the country who win. They're the country who win in style. And they're the country who win in style with a smile on their face. In some kind of comparison to Lula, well, there's a North American sociologist a few decades ago, Janet Lever, who called football a living register of Brazil's potential. There aren't that many activities in which a child born 52 years after Brazil abolished slavery can leave the stage as the king of the global game. Both Pele and Lula have in common this rags to riches and global acclaim kind of story. And I suppose the challenge of Brazilian society is, can you reproduce those kind of biographies on a mass scale?
Yeah, an enormous challenge indeed, Tim. And let's talk a bit then in that vein about the optics of Pele, a man who was obviously a black footballer who came from a working class background in Brazil. All this in a country where racism and classism remain big issues to this day.
Yes, and there's an interesting comparison that is often made between Pele and, on the one hand, Diego Maradona, and on the other hand, Muhammad Ali, because Maradona loved provoking power, and in many cases, he identified himself with the struggle of the oppressed. And you saw that both in Argentina and in Napoli in Italy, where he very much identified with the discriminated southern Italians against the snooty north. In the case of Muhammad Ali, you have a figure who gave up the peak years of his career to take a political stand. You don't find that in Pele. And I think part of the backlash, the foolish backlash against Pele as a player that we've seen recently, has come because the younger generation have identified more with Maradona's rebel stance than with Pele, who was seen, I think, by the younger generation as more of a corporate figure in a suit and didn't do a great deal to challenge power. Sometimes I think on this issue we expect too much from our sporting idols. And the comparison with Ali is so interesting because they're such different countries in racial terms. And Brazil imported millions more enslaved people than the United States. And in the United States, there's always a clear line of who is black and who isn't. White society decided it would be that way. Different case in Brazil. Small country like Portugal, they needed people. So even priests in early years in Brazil were encouraged to go out and spread their seed. And it's resulted in a society where the line between black and white is very difficult to draw. Who is black? Who is white? Does it matter? So where Ali had a movement that he could turn to for education, for backup, Pele had nothing like this. So to judge him by those standards is a little bit harsh. But there are criticisms levelled against him that he didn't do enough. Pele himself, when he was sports minister in the mid-90s, he dropped that hint as well. He at that time, he introduced freedom of contract for Brazilian footballers. And he said then, a recognition that when he was at the peak of his powers as a player in the late 60s and early 70s, maybe he could have done more for his fellow professionals. So that was an interesting dynamic going on inside Pele. But as I say, sometimes I think we expect too much from our sporting idols.